Greetings to everyone. This lecture is about offenses affecting life and the doctrine of transfer of malice. Now, as we know that when we talk about culpable homicide or the offenses affecting life, it primarily means that there is an act committed which is done either by intention or by knowledge of the offender, and in that act someone's life is at stake, or the person who is also the victim loses his life. But the loss of life or the causing death of a person is always deliberate, or the person or the offender is having the intention or knowledge of causing death of that person or the concerned person. But there are also cases where the person or the offender intends to cause the death of a person, but due to some factors, the death of another person is caused. So the question arises that whether in those cases the person can be booked for committing offense of culpable homicide or of murder, or the person, the offender, can take the plea or take the defense that he never intended to cause the death of the person, of the deceased person, but ultimately or unfortunately that death has been caused. The question is that in those cases the doctrine of transfer of malice applies. Now, malice as an part or a guilt has not been defined under any Indian law. And when we talk about malice, it boils down, or the meaning boils down to the act which is the intention of a person to cause injury, or he is having that mens rea, or his intentions are so guilty that they are done with a deliberate action keeping in mind to cause injury or death or of that person. Now, why we say transfer of malice, it becomes evident that because of the transfer of malice, the person whose death is caused is losing his life. Why? Because the intended death of the person is separate, and ultimately the death of a separate person has been caused. Section 301 of the Indian Penal Code also recognizes this doctrine of transfer of malice, which in simple terms means that a person intends to causing death of A, but ultimately due to the external factors involved in those acts, the death of B is caused. So in this case, the person or the offender is not set loose because he always had a malice or a guilty intention in his mind to cause death of a person. The only thing which has happened is that instead of the intended person, any other person has died. Section 301 of the Indian Penal Code also says that any person doing anything which he intends or knows to be likely to cause death commits culpable homicide by causing death of any person whose death he neither intends nor knows himself to be likely to cause, which suggests that these are the cases where the offender intends or has a knowledge that he will be buying his act will be causing death of a person, but death of another person has been caused. Now, the important thing to note here is that the act committed by the person is of the description of which it would have been if he had caused the death of the person whose death he intended or knew himself to be likely to cause. Which means that if we talk about the liability of this section, so this section punishes those acts where the death of the person who he never intended is caused. So the question arises whether he'll be guilty of culpable homicide or he'll be guilty of murder. So the section itself suggests that the degree of punishment or the degree of offense committed will be in contrast to the offense which had been committed if he had succeeded in his first attempt, or if like for example, if we take example, so if he kills or he intends to kill A and he kills B, so if his act of killing A, if he had succeeded in that, if the act would be murder, then he will be punished for the murder of B. And if the act would be culpable homicide in its first sense, then he'll be guilty, or he'll be charged for the offense of culpable homicide, not intending not committing of murder. So we say, or we come to the fact that here we can say that due to this doctrine, the malice has been transferred, or his guilt has been transferred in the subsequent acts also, because his guilt or his mens rea was primarily to kill A, but it does not discharges him of his liability or his guilt, that if he says that in spite of A he has killed B, or that he never intended to kill B, so he may be set loose. So these are the cases where transfer of takes place, or say transfer of malice takes place. Likewise, it is essentials to the section 301, or the transfer of the doctrine of malice. The essentials of doctrine of malice suggests that the firstly, there must be intention to kill of any person, because unless and until that intention exists, we cannot say that that intention has transferred or the malice has transferred. So primarily there must be an intention to kill, which also suggests that the causing death of the person should be a culpable homicide, or culpable homicide by which we means that it must be an act which is attracts punishment or is punishable. The second essential to section 301 is that the act has been committed with the knowledge of causing death. Again, there must be an act, there must be an intention to kill, or there must be an act which is done, or which is done after having the knowledge of causing death. Thirdly, the act has been inflicted on another person whom the offender never intended to kill, but knew that such an action can cause death to any person. So in this case, this is also important, which suggests that firstly, the offender has intended or has knowledge of causing death, then he had taken that actus reus, or the act has been inflicted on another person. Thirdly, the offender never knew that ultimately he'll be causing death of some another person. But he always knew that his actions or his acts were so that they can cause death to any other person. So in that case, we can say if the death is caused to the subsequent any other person, we can say that the transfer of malice has been completed, and the offender will be held liable under section 301, and his punishment will be in accordance to the act first committed. If the act first committed would have been murder, the offender will be held guilty of murder, or if it had been culpable homicide, he'll be guilty of culpable homicide. Thank you.